Today we have a special guest speaker that I was thrilled he said yes, he would come talk to us. We have Alex Newman. Alex Newman, you know, is a national speaker, writer. Have you all seen his work? Yes. Impressive, isn't it? Okay, so let me give you the little blurb on him. In this explosive talk, Alex will prove that the dumbing down, indoctrination, and sexualization of children in the government schools is deliberate and systemic, and that this existential threat to America, liberty, churches, and families. Even more importantly, Alex will give the history of American education and show that the current system was established by men who sought to overthrow Christianity and the American system of constitutional self-government. Today, American education is being rapidly globalized also. But the situation is not hopeless. Americans are waking up in large numbers. Have you noticed? Thank God. Alex will also offer powerful solutions to rescue our children and ensure that they will receive a true education. Would everybody welcome Alex Newman?
Hey guys, what an honor to be here. Thank you. Before I start I want to share a little family story. So 2020 election comes around, and you know, Grandpa, he's always one of those Republican guys voting for Republican candidates every time. He doesn't have to look up the positions on the issues and things. He just votes for Republicans. And then 2020, we find out he voted for Joe Biden. That's exactly what we said. What in the world is going on here? This is crazy. Emergency family meeting. And it didn't take long to come to unanimous agreement. This never would have happened if Grandpa was still alive. And I know you guys in Illinois are used to that kind of thing. The reality is they are stealing elections. They're doing it everywhere. But folks, they're not going to have to steal elections within a generation if this continues. That's the really bad news. They have now dumbed down and indoctrinated so many of our young people, they're going to have this in the bank without even using election fraud. Here's a poll that was released a few years ago, a scientific poll. 70% of my ridiculous generation, millennials, describes themselves as socialists. They're self-described socialists, more than 2/3 of us. It's one of the reasons I never tell people I'm a millennial. It's kind of like, oh, so you're an idiot, right? But this is serious, folks. On the religious front, this is even more concerning. For the first time in all American history, a majority of one generation, my generation, says they are not Christian. Christians are now in the minority. I serve as an advisor to the Nehemiah Institute. They've been studying worldview of children, churches, schools for decades now. They have found that probably 80% of Christian children from Christian homes with Christian parents will leave the faith and will leave the church after 12 years of indoctrination posing as education. So we're in a crisis, folks. Everything we hold dear is on the line. Now, this is actually an old strategy, the idea of using the government to indoctrinate and radicalize children. Adolf Hitler understood it. He was a socialist, of course, a National Socialist. That was the Nazi Party. He was wrong about just about everything, but he was correct on this. He alone who owns the youth gains the future. He was exactly right. And Mao understood that, and Lenin understood that, and Pol Pot understood that, and the totalitarians of today understand that very, very well. In fact, I'll spend a little bit of time on the history of how this system came to be. A lot of people don't realize we didn't always have a government school system. Imagine that. The men who created this specifically intended to do what it's doing now. Now, one of the key steps is to separate parents from their children, separate families. This is exactly what the U.S. government is doing right now, primarily through the vehicle of public schools. This document actually came out during the Obama regime in their final year. The Department of Education and Health and Human Services put this abomination out. They said parents could be equal partners with the government in the raising of their own children. And if you read the document, you'll see they don't even mean equal partners. You will be the junior partner. As long as you do what the feds want, then we'll let you keep your kids. If not, you have to go to mandatory interventions. You might need some parenting classes. And if you still won't comply, we might just take your kids from you. Okay? They're laying the legal groundwork to do that right now. Oh, you're not affirming your child's gender delusions? Well, we need to protect them from you. Okay, that's where this is all headed, folks. And they're very open about it. Here's the man who spent 7 years as Obama's education secretary.
And there's certain kids we should have 24/7 to really create a safe environment and give them a chance. I think all of our schools should be community centers. Our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day with a wide variety of after-school.
Yeah, we need some of the kids 24/7. The rest of them we should have for 13, 14, 15 hours a day. Now, this was interesting. This was from the current Education Secretary, Joe Biden's. His name is Miguel Cardona. He's in a Senate hearing, and he's asked whether parents should be the primary stakeholders in the education of their children. And I about spit my coffee. I wouldn't be I'm not a stakeholder. I'm dad. I'm in charge along with my wife. This is crazy. But no, we can't even be primary stakeholders. Watch.
Fairly quick answers here because I want to get to Secretary Becerra. Do you think parents should be in charge of their child's education as the primary stakeholder?
I believe parents are important stakeholders, but I also believe...
Primary.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Cardona, but no. Okay? That is bonkers. Now here's Joe Biden, the alleged president.
These aren't, we always talk about these children. They're not someone else's children. They're our children. And they are the kite strings that literally lift our national ambitions aloft in a literal sense. Think about it. If you got to do one thing to make sure the nation succeeded in the next 2 generations, what would you do? You'd want, I would say, literally, have the best educated public in the world. Have our students gain confidence enough to know what they can do, to reach in. We have an obligation. We have an obligation to help them teach and reach their potential. And you've heard me say it many times about our children, but it's true. They're all our children. And the reason you're the teachers of the year is because you recognize that. They're not somebody else's children. They're like yours when they're in the classroom. You represent a profession that helps them gain the confidence they believe they can do anything. Again, think your own lives. Think of where you gain the confidence beyond your family, God willing, you're able to. And you know what else we're finding out? We're having a big fight about it now, but I'm going to get it done eventually. Someone will.
And yet this is what the highest governmental officials in this country believe. He's talking to a room full of teacher union members. So what we're dealing with here, folks, if you want to understand the pattern here, the ideology here, just take everything the Bible teaches, flip it exactly 100% upside down, and you'll understand what they're doing. On every issue, every time. Starting with the most basic commandments, right? God said, be fruitful and multiply. Oh, no, you can't have kids. Kids are bad for the planet. God said, thou shalt not steal. Oh, well, God didn't know resources might be inequitably distributed and that there might be systemic racism and other things. We have to steal everything, but don't worry, we'll redistribute it in a fair fashion. Thou shalt not murder. Oh, well, that unborn baby is not a real human, right? Is that sounding like the Nazis? No, they're not fully human, okay? This is disgusting, and yet on every issue, every time, this is where they're going to fall. Now, they've put all of this in international agreements. A lot of people don't realize this has now been enshrined into international law. I was told I only have 6 hours today, so we're going to try to condense this. No, in all seriousness, I've got probably 600 slides here. We're only going to do about 50 of them due to time constraints. But all of this is enshrined in international agreements. I'll share one of them with you. This was signed in 1992 by President George H.W. Nouvel Order Bush. You guys probably remember him. He actually announced on TV in 1991, we're going to have a new world order. It'll be international law, and we're going to use the UN's peacekeeping forces, their military troops, to implement the vision of the UN's founders. You guys remember that guy. Well, here he is talking about Agenda 21. This is an international agreement he signed on behalf of the United States. Every other national government signed up as well. It's a UN deal.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founder.
Oh, so CNN was lying. It's not a conspiracy theory. Is anyone surprised? Now here is the leader of the Communist Party in Congress touting this very same agreement.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21 to be coordinated under the leadership of a specific
All right, so it's kind of important, right? We need a national strategy to outline comprehensive development in line with the principles of this UN deal. Actually, Bill Clinton used an executive order to inject this into every single federal agency. Okay, now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Agenda 21, and you should be, you can read the whole deal on the UN's website. Here's the summary the UN put out. They said it's intended to be implemented by every person on the planet. All of you, all of your children, all of your grandchildren, every last person living in the Amazon rainforest, everyone, everywhere. And they said it's going to require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Now, you'd think this would be something we'd have a national discussion about before signing up, but no, most of us have never heard of it. Now, they know that most older Americans, we the bitter clingers, are not going to go along with this, right? They factored that into their plans. And so, as part of their plan, turn to Chapter 36 of Agenda 21, you'll find the key element of their strategy. Notice it's the same strategy of Adolf Hitler, Chairman Mao, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, Fidel Castro. Over and over again, we see the same tactic. Chapter 36, education is critical for this ideology from hell, sustainable development. They said it's indispensable for changing people's attitudes. They say it's got to give kids the right attitudes and behaviors consistent with this ideology. It's got to include spiritual development. We'll come back to that. And it needs to be integrated into every single subject. It's an international agreement. Every nation on the planet is subjected to this madness. Here's what it looks like for kids, right? This is a textbook produced for the kids by the UN. I have a copy in my office. It's insane. And you probably see the, I think they're Hindu deities or something. They're sitting up on the clouds, and they're very upset because these storks are delivering all these babies. And on the next page, you find out why they're so upset. The earth groans every time it registers another birth. Now again, go back to the very first command that God gave people. Be fruitful and multiply. So what do they teach the kids? Exactly the opposite. Mother Earth is groaning every time you have one of those polluting children. Okay? And it gets worse from there, right? It's just absolutely nuts. Now, they're very open about the fact that they want global education to brainwash your kids to be in line with this ideology.
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So it begins with education, and it's not just any education, it's got to be global education. Now, for 100 years, they have been studying how do you shift the mindset, the worldview, the attitudes, the beliefs, the behaviors of children. And they have become absolute masters of it. I'm going to show you one example that I think probably everybody in this room, unless you're very young, has some recollection of. Right? Prior to early 2000s, sodomy was still a crime across most of this country. Now, this isn't a commentary on sodomy or homosexuality, but the idea of homosexual marriage in the early 1990s was preposterous. Okay? Absolutely unthinkable. The handful of people who were warning about it were called crazies and conspiracy theorists. And yet they were preparing our children in government schools all across America to accept this idea. And not just to accept this idea, to accept the idea that it would be imposed on us by pretend judges. Here's a documentary they showed to children from coast to coast in public schools. A little excerpt from it.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do.
Well, when you put it like that, yeah, I don't see why they shouldn't either, right? How about tell the kids the truth? Marriage is the foundational institution of any civilization. It has been for all of human history. It is the mechanism that produces the next generation, that raises the next generation, that passes on the values to the next generation. How about open up your Bibles, right? God says it's a representation of the relationship between Christ and His church. Why not teach the kids that before asking them to be pretend judges and come up with this decision? Right? Remember, they couldn't even pass this at the ballot in California. The land of fruits and nuts said no thank you, right? And yet they prepared our children in advance for this. And now we're here, okay? This is the Drag Queen Story Hour, coming soon to a public school near you. In fact, they brag on their website. They're in government schools all over the country. Here we're marching in a pride parade. Now, this is all very carefully orchestrated, and I could show you many, many more examples if we had time, but I just want to show you how in one generation, using one propaganda tool, they shifted an entire culture. They undermined the most fundamental, existential institution that is more important than any other in one generation using propaganda in the schools. And they're doing it now on issue after issue after issue. And they're very proud of it. This lady here is named Shirley McCoon. She was hired by the U.S. Department of Education back in the late 80s to come up with national education standards. This was before anybody had heard of Common Core or the nationalization of education. And she's speaking to the nation's 50 governors here at a summit convened by George H.W. Bush. And really transparent. Listen.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
How many of us signed up for a total transformation of our society? Yeah. How many people thought that's what we were doing when we put our kids on the school bus? This is disgusting, right? And they're all clapping like trained seals, the 50 governors, okay? And it gets worse. Here's how the schools will do it.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is, and then move back
use a crystal ball
and
for
figure
that,
out
right?
what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
Anticipatory socialization? What? The social change function of schools? And here we thought schools were to teach our kids how to read, write, and do math, right? Wrong, okay? So, this lady is a wackadoodle of the highest order. She is one of many top gurus in education who claims to be communicating with spiritual entities. She calls them ascended masters. She wrote a whole book that she channeled from these kooky spirits. If you read your Bible, they're not ascended masters, right? But you can read it yourself. The light shall set you free. And she's not talking about the light you're thinking of. So part of this transformation of society involves the sexualization, the demoralization of our children. So in Minnesota, they took a kid for a sex change without his parents' permission. The federal court ruled that was not an infringement on the parents' rights. Now, this I first came across on the Department of Education website for California. It's a gender transition plan. I first found this a few years ago, and the kids fill this out, and they say what gender they identify as, what name they want to use, and do your parents know? And if they don't know, well, don't worry, we'll hide it from them, okay? Turns out this is now being used in schools all over America. Even the most conservative districts in this country now have gender transition plans. Okay, this happened in Iowa, not too far from here. It's a drag show at school. I won't show all of it to you, but it's outrageous. That's a school auditorium in a public school. And it gets worse. In the interest of not showing pornography, we won't watch it all. You got the genderbread person, right? This is from the National Education Association, the biggest union in America, more than 3 million members. Several teachers sent it to me because it went out in a newsletter. And this is what they're teaching our teachers. This is how you become an inclusive school, okay?
Hi, your name is Emma, correct? And my name is Zine. What pronouns do you use?
I use she, they, them. What pronouns do you use?
I use they, them, and also just Z. And so instead of being a boy or girl or something undefined or in the middle, I kind of like, just use my name. You know, my name is Zine, so if you just use Z instead of a pronoun, it's like more personalized and like less fitting into a binary.
Okay, yeah. So for future reference, my pronouns, Generalissimo and Your Royal Highness. Okay, thank you. So folks, you know, a lot of people think, and I know Illinois people are not under this delusion, but a lot of people think, well, that doesn't happen in my state, that doesn't happen in my school district. It's happening everywhere, folks. Now, the People's Republic of California, they did a survey at the UCLA about 5 years ago, and they found that 27% of the state's children, ages 12 through 17, were now gender non-conforming. So they're boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. Now, I was a kid in the 1990s. I grew up in 8 countries on 4 continents with every kind of kid you could ever imagine, and I never once in my entire childhood met a child who was gender non-conforming. All the boys were boys, all the girls were girls. This was true of Hindus, Jews, Shintos, Buddhists, Christians, doesn't matter. Everywhere I went, there was only boys and girls. The word transgender wasn't in the dictionary. And now, 5 years ago in California, 27% of the kids are gender non-conforming. Now, Utah, probably the most conservative pro-family state in this country, supermajority of Republicans in the legislature, virtually every county run by Republicans. I was there a few years ago, and some members of the state school board and I met at the state capitol, and they gave me this data. This came out of their state medical prescriptions database, the drugs that doctors are prescribing. They found there had been a 10,000% increase in a period of 5 years in the number of underage girls who were going through medical transitions. This is where they're being put on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, testosterone injections, ultimately double mastectomies and genital mutilation. In Utah, a 10,000% increase in 5 years. Are they putting some in the water? Maybe. But what's really happening is these kids are being indoctrinated in their public schools. Okay, now 20% of millennials identify as LGBTQ. Less than 50% of teens now identify as straight, according to this survey. And I mean, if you look at all the data that's coming out of the schools, it's insane. CDC just produced some data that 60% of teen girls in America now feel persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. 30% of them actually thought about suicide. More than 10% of them actually tried to commit suicide in the last year. And they say, oh, if we just do more LGBT propaganda, we'll be good. No. Okay, it gets crazier, believe it or not. In the state of California, they passed a law very similar to what you guys have here, that all the kids in government schools must have mandatory LGBT indoctrination. So we got some of these curriculum, and they start off with Harvey Milk, the pervert child rapist who supposedly kicked off the LGBT revolution in America. And as they go on, then they get to ancient Greece, and they just casually throw it out there. Oh yeah, grown men used to have sexual relations with boys. No big deal. And so this mom who sent me this, Stephanie Yates, wonderful lady, she confronts the assistant superintendent of curricula at her school district, says, what are you people doing? Why are you teaching my kids pedophilia? What's wrong with you? And in a sane world, she said, we'd never do that. Where'd you get such an idea? Here's what she actually said. Yeah, it's just a different sexual orientation. Quit being such a prude, okay? Now, we all recognize this is insane, but your kindergartner who's being told that raping children is just a different sexual orientation, they don't understand that that's insane. Mom and dad said to listen to the teacher. Okay, so project the lines out. What happens to the next generation? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out, okay? UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, now has global sex education standards. They would blow your mind. I can't even talk about them in this room. And it all goes back to this disgusting excuse for a human being here. And I'm usually a super nice guy. I almost never say anything bad about anybody. But this guy here, he and his minions were responsible for the rape and sexual torture of thousands of children. And they came to the absolutely insane conclusion that children are sexual from birth, and so we have to start sexualizing them as soon as we can get our hands on them. Won't go into all the details. He bragged about what they were doing in his own books. Now, we still have this idea that our kids are learning something. They're not. Without getting too deep into Common Core, the same people who brought you Common Core also brought you the next generation pseudoscience standards. 12 years, you'll hear about man-made global warming, gender theory. You'll learn that we all came from slime and that there is no God and that there were monkeys in between. What you will never learn in 12 years, not once, if you follow the standards, is the scientific method. Imagine that. Right? If the kids knew the scientific method, they'd know everything else they're being taught is a total fraud. So you can't teach them the scientific method. Okay? The fake history is absolutely false. It is revolutionary. It is designed to destroy this country, to destroy your family, to destroy your children, and to ultimately bring about a revolution in America. Now again, we still think our kids are learning how to read, write, and do math. They're not. The government itself will tell you this. Here's the results from their latest National Assessment of Educational Progress. Here's the last Deputy Secretary of Education condensing those results into a nice little soundbite for you.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that two-thirds, get this, two-thirds of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
So 2/3 of them are not proficient in any core subject. And by proficient, they don't mean like they're good at it, right? I mean, they can barely eke by on the most dumbed-down standards we've ever had in our nation. So let that sink in. Imagine that in any other industry. Imagine a fast food restaurant pops up, and less than 1/3 of the people who order a cheeseburger actually get a cheeseburger. Most of them get toxic waste with a decomposing rat on a piece of moldy bread. The SWAT team would be breaking down the door faster than you could say edumacation. And yet the schools do it and they say, oh, just give us more money, okay? Then it'll be fine. We just need more time with your children. This is a crime, folks, and in any other industry, we would recognize this as a massive criminal fraud. The people behind the fraud would be hauled off to jail, and rightfully so. And here it's orders of magnitude worse because it's our children. And yet we do nothing. We debate whether we should increase their funding. Okay? It's absolutely bonkers. So you can't have prayer, you can't have Bible, you can't have the Ten Commandments, but you can go to mosques on field trips. You can have the 5 pillars of Islam. You can have little children in West Virginia and Tennessee recite the Islamic Shahada, claiming that Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his messenger. You can do Buddhism in the classroom. They call it mindfulness. You can do Hinduism in the classroom, and they're doing it openly, including right here in Chicago, throwing flower petals and lighting incense with little Hindu gods in the front. Now, in North Carolina, they caught them forcing the Christian kids to stand up in front of the class to apologize for their Christian privilege. In California, the State Board of Education voted unanimously for an ethnic model studies curriculum that required elementary school children to chant to the demonic pagan Aztec deities of cannibalism, war, and human sacrifice. The guy who wrote the curriculum, goes by the name Cuauhtemoc, says we should be asking these deities for help waging a counter-genocide against Christians. Okay? They're gathering more data on your children than you can imagine, hundreds of data points, dental health, mental health, political views, what kind of food you have in your fridge, how does daddy talk to mommy, does anybody drink at your house, have you got guns at home, okay, all of it. And they're using this was a report from 10 years ago from the Department of Education, they're going to use all this data to make predictions about the future behavior of your children. Now, they have a very simple and yet very effective way for getting kids to abandon the moral values and beliefs of their parents. And they did this to me, so I remember it very, very clearly. They might have done it to some of you. They implemented this in American schools back in the late 1960s. They call it values clarification. The UN says it should be done in every school to every child. So here's how they did it to me. They said, Alex, you're on a ship, and you're with your classmates, and the ship is sinking, and you all pile off into the lifeboat, but whoops, 11 of you jumped in, and there's only space for 10. So, let's give you some background on the individuals. You've got a teacher, and you better not throw the teacher out or you're all failing. You've got a doctor, you've got a lawyer, you've got a nurse, you've got an engineer. Who are you going to kick out of the boat? Who are you going to murder so that everybody else can survive? It's for the greater good, after all, right? And we all know the answer, I think. It's obviously throw the lawyer out. Of course. No, but in all seriousness, if the kids are actually thinking about this, they'd say, well, we don't need to murder somebody. I'll just swim alongside the raft, and when I get tired, we'll rotate, and then nobody has to die. But no, what actually happens is the kids say, Mom and Dad said we shouldn't murder. The pastor said we shouldn't murder. The Bible says we shouldn't murder. They must be dumb. They never considered this situation where there was 11 of us in a life raft and we had to murder somebody. Clearly, Mom and Dad don't know what they're talking about. Ethics and morality are relative. And so what happens? In an instant, they just shattered everything that Mom and Dad worked to instill over 15 years. And I'll tell you, it worked for me. Might have worked for some of you in this audience. Okay? So that's what they're doing. Now, in the interest of time, we're going to skip some of this, but I want to share with you how far we have fallen as a nation. Okay? Long before we had anything remotely resembling a government school, John Adams wrote in a letter to a friend that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Okay? Read the Federalist Papers. These were written for average Americans. We have data on the literacy of early Americans. This was published in 1812. Most young Americans can read, write, and cipher, do math. Not more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly, even neatly. Today, it's exactly the reverse. If you can find 4 kids who can write legibly, that is quite an accomplishment. Alexis de Tocqueville came over here in the early 1800s, and he couldn't believe the quality of education. He said everybody's super well educated. They know their Constitution, their history, their religion. Amazing. Now, here you see this in presidential speeches from 1800 to 2000. Okay? That's based on complexity and grade level and length. You see where it was back in 1800? You see where it is now in 2000. Now we talk like Kamala Harris. Russia, big. Ukraine, small. Okay? I mean, that's what's happening, folks. We have been dumbed down on a massive, massive level. So how did this happen? Okay, we're going to do a very abbreviated history lesson here. The first guy I can find who actually proposed the idea of government education was Plato. And I think people who like to sound sophisticated think, oh, Plato, cool. Plato was actually a totalitarian. He believed philosopher kings should rule over us and that we should submit and that the government should educate us to be good, submissive citizens of the philosopher kings. That idea didn't go over very well. Sparta tried it. It didn't work out well. But we didn't have government education for about 1,800 years of Western Christian church history. The idea that the government would educate our kids was pretty much inconceivable. And then this guy came along, Robert Owen. He was a communist before Karl Marx even came along. He rejected the Bible and Christianity. He so fervently believed these stupid ideas that he actually set up a commune not far from here called New Harmony in Indiana. And it failed in less than 2 years because when you get rid of private property and family, things don't work out well. Okay, so he actually wrote all these silly writings about how the government ought to educate children. And the Prussian dictator got a hold of him through his ambassador. And according to Owens in his autobiography, this Prussian dictator so much approved of these ideas that he ordered such a system to be constructed in Prussia. Now, in Prussia, it was the first example we can find of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. Turned out to be a disaster. Within a few generations, the Germans are goose-stepping around and putting people in concentration camps and all the rest of it. But it actually laid the foundation for what would come to America later. Now, Robert Owens, the guy who came up with this idea, actually founded what was described by a whistleblower as a secret society. Okay, it was modeled on the Carbonari. This is from a whistleblower named Orsis Brownson. He defected from this movement. He became a Catholic and repented of this evil he was involved in. And he said the ultimate objective was to what? Get rid of Christianity. Okay, and they did this by trying to change public opinion and getting men elected to the legislature who would support government education. Well, it didn't take off in America. Parents thought, no, we can educate our kids just fine, thanks. And if we need any help, we'll go to the local church. We don't need you, thank you. But Horace Mann, first ever Secretary of Education in any state in America, was in Massachusetts. He was a legislator, a Utopian, also rejected the Bible. He loved the Prussian system, and he incorporated it into Massachusetts. He wanted to get the Bible out of education. Right away, the quackery came pouring in. He wanted to equalize all men. We don't have time today to get into the whole word method, but I've got a whole book on this. If you wonder, how did 50% of Americans end up functionally illiterate? It's a fascinating story. It begins with this guy here, Horace Mann, and the quackery he introduced in his schools. Basically, they teach kids to memorize whole words rather than teaching them that each letter represents one or more sounds and that you blend those together. It's absolute quackery. As soon as government got control of education, the quackery poured in. Then this system, after it developed in Massachusetts, Horace Mann traveled around the country urging other states to set up similar systems. And then along comes John Dewey, who's very often known today as the founding father of America's public school system. In fairness, I think he deserves to share some of the blame with Horace Mann and Robert Owens. But John Dewey, somebody mentioned already today, he was a socialist. He was, in fact, a socialist. He went to the Soviet Union and he loved what they were doing. He actually outlined this crazy plan to dumb down the American people. We reprinted it as an appendix in the book Crimes of the Educators. It says, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew that if Americans, if teachers, if parents understood what they were doing, they would shut this down immediately. So the Rockefellers gave him millions of dollars. He set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago, cranked out a bunch of kids who couldn't read, couldn't tell right from wrong, couldn't do math. He said, that will be perfect. We'll do that all across America. Moved over to Teachers College at Columbia University, produced a bunch of textbooks with his disciples, and presto, welcome to America in 2023. So this quackery is still used in the classrooms today. But I want to talk to you a little bit about John Dewey's religion, because he was a religious man, just not in the sense that normal people, I think, would recognize. But he was one of the founders of the humanist religion. He was one of the authors of the Humanist Manifesto. These are direct quotes from the manifesto. The very first tenet is that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. That's interesting. What does the Bible say? In the beginning, God created. Okay, so these two religions are obviously not compatible with each other. Now, even if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, and I think you should be, it has eternal implications, by the way, there are really important political implications to this. Okay, our founding fathers didn't think you had to be a Bible scholar. They said these truths are self-evident. God created us. God gave us rights. The purpose of government is to protect these rights. I mean, they got these ideas from the Bible. Yes, God said don't steal, therefore government must protect your right to property. God said don't murder, therefore government must protect your right to life. But ultimately, if you don't believe that there is a God, a creator, you can't have God-given rights. In other words, you have no freedom at all, except what the Utopians decide to give you. Now, one of his colleagues in this actually wrote a book about how they were going to use the public school system to brainwash Americans and others, and they still bragged about this back in the 80s. The classroom is the arena of conflict between the rotting corpse of Christianity and the new faith of humanism. Now, this idea that man can be his own little God, that we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, it's actually not a new religion. In fact, it's the oldest lie in the book, Genesis chapter 3. God knows that when you eat thereof, then ye shall be as gods. Okay. Same lie we heard in the beginning. So in 1962, the Supreme Court said you cannot have prayer in the schools. In 1963, no more Bible. They said First Amendment required this. Well, if you read the First Amendment, it applies to Congress. When the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of our states had established churches. It clearly was not meant to prohibit a prayer in a school. One of the justices who wrote the dissent actually hit the nail on the head. He said what happened here was the establishment of a religion of secularism. In other words, under the guise of stopping the establishment of religion, they established a new false religion from the pit of hell. And they forced us to pay for it with our tax dollars. This is the false religion that is taught to every child in a public school today. I don't care if they tell you it's neutral or secular or whatever. They're all learning this false religion. Okay? Now they're going to a one world educational system. They've been working on this for generations. This guy here was the first head of UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, and he was also the head of the British Humanist Association. And he was the head of the British Eugenics Society, the weirdos who believed these pseudoscientific racial quack ideas that some races were better than other races, and we should breed humans like cattle. So they've been pretty open about this in their international agreements. I mentioned this is all in their own documents, right? And if you review what's happening in your local school, it's all there, okay? In 2016, they got a new global action plan for education. They said education has to shape the spirituality of your children. We'll come back to that. Now, Obama's education secretary said the UN Education Agency was his partner in turning your kids into green global citizens. He quoted a communist terrorist and said education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. It goes on and on. But I want to share with you now, the UN has something they call the World Core Curriculum. This was developed by the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. He's called the father of global education. He was a wackadoodle of the highest order as well. He believed the UN was actually the body of Christ. If you read your Bible, that's preposterous. But part of this World Core Curriculum, he actually said this in the foreword to the teacher's manual. He says the underlying philosophy upon which it's based to be found in the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Jval Kuhl, which is cool until you realize that Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. And Jval Kuhl was not a Tibetan or a teacher. He was actually an ascended master, which, if you read your Bible, is not an ascended master. It's a demon, right? Alice Bailey claimed to be channeling these spiritual entities that gave her insight into the coming New Age, which, by the way, requires the abolishing of what she described as the great heresy of separateness, which is essentially biblical Christianity. Now, in her book, Her and Her Demons, Education in the New Age, wrote that world citizenship needs to be the goal. We need a world federation or a world government and a world brain. This was long before Google and artificial intelligence and transhumanism. They say we need to synthesize Marxism and neo-scholasticism, and we're going to do this using the methods of John Dewey. Okay? It's all out in the open, folks. You can verify everything I'm telling you. You can get these books yourself. Now, Bill Gates of hell actually went over to UNESCO headquarters and signed an agreement with the head of UNESCO on behalf of Microsoft. And they agreed they were going to create global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, global technological systems, all based on UNESCO values. And so then Bill Gates came back to America, starts pouring millions and then billions of dollars into this atrocity we know as Common Core. Here's an ad they produced bragging about Common Core.
The Education 2030 agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
They match up against international standards. So kids in Seattle and Chicago will learn the same garbage as kids in Shanghai under the most murderous dictatorship in human history. Isn't that cute? All righty. So now we come to the end. I'm going to share with you a little bit on my thoughts about how we get out of this mess and, more importantly, what God's Word says about all these questions. So the first question, can we reform the school system? And as far as I'm concerned, that's like asking me if we can reform cancer. Okay, no. You want to get rid of the cancer. And so, that's not to say that there are not positive things we can do within the school system, but ultimately I think we need to completely rethink this. We made a catastrophic mistake when we said, yeah, let's let the government educate our children. Okay, now, a lot of people think, well, we'll just pass more laws, right? We're doing this in Florida. We're passing all kinds of laws, stopping the CRT, the sexualization. They don't care about your laws. They don't care what your school board does. They will keep doing it. Now, that's Congressman Thomas Massey. He's got a great bill to shut down the Department of Education. I love that bill, but it's not going to solve the problem. So as I see it, we really have two options. We either submit to this crazy global agenda that is going to result in the destruction of our freedoms, our country, our families, and our churches, or we get our kids out as quickly as possible in as big a numbers as we can. So I tell families, parents, like, the school building is on fire, and your kids are inside, and you hear them screaming. What's the first thing we do? Well, we sign a petition, of course. Yeah. We'll discuss what color the wallpaper should be. Now, all this is crazy, right? If you're a parent, you know that if the school building's on fire and your kids are inside, you run inside, doesn't matter if you die, and you pull your children out. That's how I think we need to think about this. And honestly, a fire is not an adequate analogy. A fire might hurt your child physically. These schools are destroying your children physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, academically, in every possible way. It's much worse than a fire, folks. We've got to get serious. So, I say all that. Once your children are safely out, I can't encourage you strongly enough to get involved in the school board. Sound the alarm. Talk to your state legislator. But first things first, get your children out of the burning building, then worry about the other things. Pastors, priests, and rabbis, you need to be sounding the alarm. Your congregation is depending on you. You're supposed to be shepherding God's flock. And you are not warning them about the wolves that are devouring their children. I'm sorry, but you're derelict in your duty. And I know you don't want to offend the public school teacher. I get it. Guess what? The public school teachers know all of this. That's why they don't send their kids to public school. Okay? They send their kids to private school and they homeschool. So you got to sound the alarm, folks. Really good things happening. I do want to share this about what God's Word says. First of all, in Proverbs 26, it says, Caesar needs to be training up the children in the way that they should go, and even when they're old. One person's laughing. Now, this is for parents, right? You, parents, you should be teaching your children when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you're waking up, when you're going to sleep. There's no time for Caesar to be involved. Again, parents, bring up your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, the Bible doesn't tell you how many credit hours of English or science are appropriate for a well-rounded education. Okay, that's up to the parents. But it does tell you the most foundational element. In Proverbs 9:10, we read, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How much fear of the Lord are the kids getting in the public schools? None. Therefore, there's no knowledge and there's no wisdom being imparted there. Jesus put it really simply. There's a very simple litmus test you can do. Whoever's not with me is against me. So there's two options. Anybody want to make the argument that the schools are with Christ? Open microphone. Yeah, we all know that's ridiculous. Even the protesters outside know that's ridiculous. So we also have to govern ourselves. That's my family and me, homeschooling on an island. Wonderful news, folks, on homeschooling. Millions of families have left in recent years. Millions more will leave in the years ahead. All of these men here were primarily educated at home. They built the greatest, freest, most prosperous nation in the history of the world. Homeschoolers are running circles around the victims of government schools on every metric, socialization, academics. I mean, it's not even close, okay? And it's getting better and better. If you need some resources, we got some in the back. We have some wonderful magazines. You can share this information with other people. We have DVDs of talks similar to this. I've got books. I serve on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. It's an online K-12 school. I taught there for 12 years. It's amazing. I'm the volunteer executive director of this wonderful ministry, Public School Exit. We're working to help churches and parents get the kids out as quickly as they possibly can. Amen. All right. And publicschoolexit.com, you can find us there. For legislators, we have some good ideas. You guys actually have some decent laws in Illinois. We do need to be prepared because they're coming for our freedom. They're telling us they're coming for our freedom. They want your children. They're not happy about this. And, a lot of us say, well, they're not going to take my freedom. I've got my AR-15. Yeah, well, what are you going to do with your AR-15 when your kids are the ones who show up to take it from you? Okay, your guns are no good when they've indoctrinated 80% of the next generation. So, folks, I just want to leave you with this. Our founders sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor so that we could live free. I know it's a sacrifice to educate your children. I know it's a sacrifice to afford a private school or to afford homeschooling. But if our founders could put all of it on the line, we need to do that too. And what we're dealing with, folks, is not just simply an educational battle. It's not a political problem. It's much, much deeper. Okay, we are battling against evil. We are battling against the forces of hell. Ephesians 6:12 says this: we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. Don't sacrifice your children to this evil. And I have really good news. I know how this ends. It's not going to end well for these evildoers. Thanks, guys. God bless you.